Hey there guys, so I'm back today with a video for you. I'm going to share with you one of my favorite parts of Beautiful Creatures. Don't worry, the part that I'm going to read and share with you does not have any big spoilers. It's just simply one of my most favorite parts of the book, simply because I grew up in the South and I'm like, that is exactly how people talk, and it's just a really fun section for me. So, but if you don't want to be spoiled, I understand there's plenty of other things for you to do on the internet and you can just go ahead and click off, but I promise there isn't going to be any spoilers. And if you do decide to continue watching this video, you will get to hear my Southern twang come out a bit. So the chapter that I'm going to be reading for you is the Sisters chapter. This is the part of the book where we are introduced to Lynn's three great aunts, and let me tell you, they are quite the characters. There is only one word to describe the scene when I arrived at the sisters' house: chaos. Aunt Mercy answered the door, hair still in rollers. "Thank goodness you're here, Ethan. We have an emergency on our hands," she said, pronouncing the E as if it was a word all by itself. Half the time I couldn't understand them at all. Their accents were so thick and their grammar so bad, but that's the way it was in Gatlin. You could tell how old someone was by the way they spoke. "Ma'am, Harlan James been injured, and I'm not convinced he ain't about to pass over." She whispered the two last words like God himself might be listening, and she was afraid to give him any ideas. Harlan James was Aunt Prudence's Yorkshire Terrier, named after her recent late husband. "What happened?" "I'll tell you what happened," Aunt Prudence said, appearing out of nowhere with the first aid kit in her hand. "Grace tried to kill poor Harlan James, and he is barely hanging on." "I didn't try to kill him," Aunt Grace shrieked from the kitchen. "Don't you tell tales, Prudence Jane. It was an accident." "Ethan, you call Dean Wilkins and you tell him we have an emergency," Aunt Prudence instructed, pulling a capsule of smelling salts and two extra large band-aids out of the first aid kits. "We're losing him." Harlan James was lying on the kitchen floor, looking traumatized but nowhere near close to death. His back leg was tucked up underneath him and it dragged behind him when he tried to get up. "Grace, the Lord as my witness, if Harlan James dies—" "He's not gonna die, Aunt Prue. I think his leg is broken." "What happened?" "Grace tried to beat him to death with a broom." "That's not true. I told you. I wasn't wearing my spectacles and he looked like a wharf rat running through the kitchen." "How would you know what a wharf rat looks like? You've never been to Wharf in all your life." So I drove the sisters, who were completely hysterical, and Harlan James, who probably wished he was dead, to Dean Wilkins' place in their 1964 Cadillac. Dean Wilkins ran the feed store, but he was the closest thing to a vet in town. Luckily, Harlan James had only suffered a broken leg, so Dean Wilkins was up to the task. By the time we got back to the house, I was wondering if I wasn't the crazy one for thinking I'd be able to get any information out of the sisters. Thelma's car was in the driveway. My dad had hired Thelma to keep an eye on the sisters after Aunt Grace almost burned the house down 10 years ago when she put a lemon meringue pie in the oven and left it in there all afternoon when they were at church. "Where you girls been?" Thelma called from the kitchen. They bumped into each other trying to push their way into the kitchen to tell Thelma about their misadventure. I slumped into one of the mismatched chairs next to Grace, who looked depressed about being the villain of the story again. I pulled the locket out of my pocket, holding the chain and the handkerchief, and spun it around a few times. "What you got there, handsome?" Thelma asked, pinching some snuff out of the can on the windowsill and tucking it into her bottom lip, which looked even weirder than it sounded, since Thelma was kind of dainty and resembled Dolly Parton. "It's just a locket I found out by Ravenwood Plantation." "Ravenwood? What the devil were you doing out there?" "My friend's staying there." You mean Lena Duquesne?" Aunt Mercy asked. Of course she knew. The whole town knew. This was Gatlin. "Yes, ma'am. We're in the same class at school." I had their attention. "We found this locket in the garden behind the great house. We didn't know who it belonged to, but it looks really old." "That's not Macon Ravenwood's property. That's part of Greenbrier," Aunt Prue said, sounding sure of herself. "Let me get a look at that," Aunt Mercy said, taking her glasses out of her pocket, her housecoat. I handed the locket over, still wrapped in the handkerchief. It It has an inscription. I can't read that. Grace, can you make that out? She asked, handing the locket to Grace. I don't see nothing at all, Aunt Grace said, squinting hard. There are these 2 sets of initials. Right here, I said, pointing to the grooves in the metal, ECW and GKD. And if you flip the disc over, there's a date, February 11th, 1865. That date seems real familiar, Aunt Prudence says. Mercy, what happened on that date? Weren't you married on that date, Grace? 1865, not 1965, Aunt Grace corrected. Their hearing wasn't much better than their vision. February 11th, 1865. That was the year the Federals almost burned Gatlin to the ground, Aunt Mercy said. Our great-granddaddy lost everything in that fire. Don't you remember that story, girls? General Sherman and the Union Army marched clean through the South, burning everything in their path, including Gatlin. They called it the Great Burning. At least part of every plantation in Gatlin was destroyed except Ravenwood. My granddaddy used to say that Abraham Ravenwood must have made a deal with the devil that night. What do you mean? It was the only way that place could have been left standing. Federals burned every plantation along the river, one at a time, till they got to Ravenwood. They just marched on past like it wasn't there at all. The way that Granddaddy told it, that wasn't the only thing strange about that night, Aunt Prue said, feeding Harlan James a piece of bacon. Abraham had a brother, lived there with him. He had just up and disappeared that night. Nobody ever saw him again. That doesn't seem that strange. Maybe he was killed by the Union soldiers or trapped in one of those burning houses, I said. Aunt Grace raised an eyebrow at me. Or maybe it was something else. They never did find a body. I realized people had been talking about the Ravenwoods for generations. It didn't start with Macon Ravenwood. I wonder what else the sisters knew. Alrighty, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed that little nugget of gold right there. And I also hope that you enjoyed my Southern Twang making an appearance for you guys for this video. I felt like it was definitely necessary reading that part out loud for you guys. Like I said, I hope that you guys enjoyed watching, and until next time, bye.